Welcome to the asynchronous portion of Week 5. Having covered the Middle East region and discussed the Turkey-focused case study during our interactive Zoom session earlier this week, let us now shift our attention to the last, but by no means least important, emerging and frontier markets regional coverage, that being the region of sub-Saharan Africa. Long viewed as the forgotten continent, Africa in general, and sub-Saharan African economies in particular, are undeniably holding distinctive economic and developmental promise. In many ways, the African continent in the 21st century has been witnessing a replay of the 19th century so-called scramble for Africa. Much of this, unsurprisingly, relates to natural resource abundance on the continent. In fact, writing in his book Africa First, Igniting a Growth Revolution, published in 2020, the author Jackie Cilliers, who is the founder of the South Africa-based Institute for Security Studies, noted, quote, "Much of Africa's recent growth was enabled by the commodities supercycle that started in 1996, peaked in 2011, and is still in a downswing, even though the Arab Spring caused the brief spike in oil prices," end quote. He goes on to say, quote, "The extent to which African countries are dependent on commodities when measured by the value of exports has also increased. With most of this exported to Europe and increasingly China, it is unclear exactly when the downturn that started after the 2011 peak will bottom out. Based on the duration of previous cycles, it can take anywhere from 5 to 17 years before a general improvement in commodity prices occurs again." And finally, he says, "There is ample evidence that commodity dependence leads to slow and poor quality growth over long time horizons without a very deliberate effort at using the income to diversify the economic base," end quote. Against this backdrop, Africa is very likely to remain a marginal player in the global economy, even though its share of the world population is set to increase significantly, with the continent expected to cross the 2 billion mark by 2040. On the whole, the author argues that if the African continent stays on its current economic trajectory, the continent is likely to continue to slip further and further behind global averages of well-being unless the continent can reverse the trend of growing divergence by focusing on 11 key areas of improvements. And these include achieving a demographic dividend, improving health conditions, rejuvenating education, triggering an agricultural revolution, rolling out social grants for Africa, engineering and manufacturing a transition through a Made in Africa scenario, leapfrogging through various technologies, securing trade integration through the implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area, bringing about a rapid decline in violence and insecurity, continuing progress in the fourth wave of democracy, and gaining from external support. Now, judging by this assessment, the developmental and growth challenges on the African continent are indeed very real and significant, but not insurmountable. At the present time, according to Jackie Cilliers, quote, "The African continent is home to 24 of 31 low-income countries around the world. Additionally, African economies account for 21 of the 47 lower middle-income countries globally, and only 8 out of 60 upper middle income countries, namely Algeria, Botswana, Equatorial Guinea, Gabon, Libya, Mauritius, Namibia, and South Africa. Of 80 high-income countries, only one is in Africa, and that is the island state of the Seychelles. On first thought, it would thus not be surprising that the African continent has received comparatively little attention compared to some of the other emerging and frontier market regions we have covered thus far. At the same time, however, much of the emerging and frontier market success depends on timely identification of potential growth opportunities. As such, the African continent, and especially sub-Saharan African economies, should probably command more attention than they are currently receiving. In fact, between 2010 and 2016, the McKinsey Global Institute released 2 reports titled Lions on the Move: Realizing the Potential of Africa's Economies. Incidentally, I will provide links to both of these reports on our Canvas page in case you may want to check them out. By 2018, this led to the publication through Harvard Business Review Press of a book titled African Business Revolution: How to Succeed in the World's Next Big Growth Market. To highlight the importance of contextual understanding of both developmental challenges and long-term economic prospects of African economies, let me briefly read a particularly telling example from the preface of the book, because it captures the degree to which clear and objective understanding and analysis of African economies may still not be at the level at which it should be. So this is how the authors set the stage for their discussion of Africa's business revolution in their book. Quote, "As global business interest in Africa has blossomed, we have found ourselves traveling the world to help executives understand where the true opportunity lies and how their businesses can seize that opportunity before their competitors do. A few years back, one of us, Acha, that's one of the names of the authors, found himself in Seoul, South Korea, presenting to the chairman of one of the largest Korean conglomerates. At that stage, the company had almost no presence in Africa, and its executives were concerned that the Chinese competitors were stealing a march on them. As always, the McKinsey team arrived at the meeting armed with a PowerPoint presentation, the first page of which was a map of Africa. We had intended to flip quickly past it, but the chairman stopped us in our tracks. And he said, 'You have made a mistake. You have 2 countries called Congo.' In fact, there are 2 countries named after the mighty river Congo. One is the mineral-rich but conflict-ridden Democratic Republic of the Congo, or DRC, with a population of around 87 million and a land area 80 times that of Belgium, its former colonial power. On the other side of the river is the Republic of the Congo, with a population of just 5 million, but a GDP per capita 10 times that of its neighbor, reflecting its position as a significant oil producer. Yes, there are 2 Congos. Why not? There are 2 Koreas, we told the chairman. There were laughs all around, but this moment of confusion underlying the real issue facing any company seeking to build or grow a business in Africa: how to navigate the continent's bewildering scale and complexity. Africa has 54 countries with a combined population of 1.2 billion. It has over 1,000 languages and huge diversity in income levels, resource endowment, infrastructure development, educational attainment, and business sophistication. It is one thing to get a handle on the physical map of Africa, but it is an even greater challenge to create an accurate mental map of the continent. In our experience, the instinct of most business people is to underestimate Africa's size and potential as a market and overestimate the challenges of doing business there." End quote. This account, I think you would agree, serves as a powerful example of the importance of understanding the challenges and opportunities on the African continent. And as always, we are not going to be able to do justice to the complexity and diversity of economic development and growth contexts in sub-Saharan Africa. However, it is my hope that we can at least raise general awareness about the very real growth and investment potential that currently exists on the African continent today. And yes, in some countries, it will be decidedly more prominent than in others. In 2015, the online platform Africa on the Rise featured a story about Dubai-based emerging market private equity group Abraj Capital that had succeeded in raising more than $1.3 billion for 2 funds investing in Africa. This milestone served as a compelling reminder that African economies are among the fastest growing in the world today, and that the continent as a whole is very likely poised to transform the global economic landscape, especially in the realm of low-end and labor-intensive manufacturing in the very near future. In the graphic shown here, the online platform Africa on the Rise reminded its readers that sub-Saharan Africa's annual GDP growth between 2000 and 2010 averaged nearly 6% per year and would be expected to increase to 7% per year over the next 20 years. Over the years, perceptive observers would also have noticed the significant change in how the African continent has come to be viewed. Back in 2011, Harvard Business Review began to talk about Africa as the next growth market. The message was unmistakable. Whereas previously Africa might have been synonymous with disease, poverty, famine, foreign aid, etc., the continent is increasingly holding promise when it comes to trade, creativity, entrepreneurship, etc. In fact, in the words of the authors of that article, quote, "In many ways, Africa holds the same potential that China did 20 years ago. A large rural population is moving to the cities, landing jobs with higher incomes and starting to enjoy discretionary spending. Demand is growing, and foreign direct investment has soared from $9.4 billion in 2000 to $46.4 billion in 2009, end quote. Africa's diversified economic landscape, meanwhile, helped to reinforce optimism about the continent's economic competitiveness potential down the road. The Harvard Business Review study differentiated between 4 types of economies in Africa. At one end of the spectrum, we can find so-called diversified economies, which, as you can see from the chart, include Egypt, Morocco, South Africa, and Tunisia. These economies feature sizable and developed manufacturing and service industries, and, given their citizens' comparatively high per capita incomes, represent Africa's largest consumer markets. The oil exporting economies, meanwhile, rank among Africa's least diversified economies and are disproportionately vulnerable to the so-called resource curse and the consequences of the Dutch disease. So-called transition economies, which among others include the West African country of Ghana and the East African country of Kenya, exhibit not only high economic growth potential, but may also be seen as ideal markets for early competitive positioning. And finally, the least attractive economies are those that are still stuck in the pre-transition phase. Though burdened by institutional voids, political instability, or the risk thereof, and fluctuating growth rates, these African frontier economies, such as Ethiopia, Mali, and Sierra Leone, remain distinctly high-risk investment propositions, but potentially worth keeping on the radar screen for the long term. One economy I would like to draw your attention to here as well, as it was not yet included in a neat category at the time this article was published, is Rwanda. Most people may associate Rwanda primarily with the 1994 genocide. And yet, under its subsequent leader, Paul Kagame, the country has committed itself to national reconciliation and has embarked on an impressive economic growth and development path that has earned, perhaps not unjustified, the label of Singapore of Africa. I will be sure to include a few relevant documentaries on Rwanda which you might find instructive. Now, taking into account all these situational realities, as well as the political and economic developments, it is certainly conceivable that the African continent, and sub-Saharan Africa in particular, may yet give rise to 21st century economic success stories comparable to those of East and Southeast Asian economies in the second half of the 20th century. And looking at the changing narrative pushed by journals of opinion over time, the sense of optimism about the African continent is readily apparent. Back in 1984, Time magazine talked about Africa's woes, and The Economist described Africa as a hopeless continent. At the dawn of the second decade of the 21st century, this bleak picture of Africa was replaced by headlines that touted the rise of Africa, with The Economist leading the way in 2011 and Time magazine following suit a year later, even using the same Africa Rising label. Africa's demographic outlook is a further contributing factor behind its economic prospects. If, as Jackie Cilliers had mentioned in his Africa First book, more and more of the continent's population will have access to education, and not just education, but increasingly higher quality education. If and when this growth imperative can be achieved, the economic potential for Africa looks very promising indeed. As you can see from this chart, the African continent will stand to benefit from a youthful population well into the 22nd century. World Population Review predicts that between 2019 and 2100, Africa's population will increase by some 227%. Or to put this in global perspective, Africa's share of the global population, according to a United Nations medium fertility variant projection, could reach 40%, second only to Asia with 43%. Geographer Simon Kustenmacher draws on UN population data to illustrate Africa's population growth trend from 1950 to the present, and then projecting 80 years hence into the future to give a sense of how the global population distribution will look like in 2021. And you can see the animation on the chart here. So I will let the chart go all the way to 2100 before proceeding to the next slide. At the same time, this population explosion in Africa will also lead to the continent being home to most of the world's megacities by 2100, as you can see on this chart as well. And again, I will give some time for the animation to run through again so you can have a closer look at it. By 2100, some of the most notable megacities on the African continent will include the city of Lagos in Nigeria, the city of Kinshasa in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and Dar es Salaam in Tanzania. Apart from the demographic dividend, Sub-Saharan Africa is also, for the most part, exhibiting encouraging migration trends. And perhaps most encouraging is the fact that, according to a study by Jacana Partners, upwards of some 70% of diaspora African MBA students plan to return home following the completion of their studies in the US or Europe. Their willingness to do so is a strong indication of their belief in the inherent entrepreneurial and economic growth potential of their respective home countries. Such trends, when coupled with increased political stability and freedom, institutional transparency and accountability, and growing levels of social innovation, should be considered an intriguing telltale sign for analysts that are trying to ascertain the near to medium-term investment and growth potential of sub-Saharan African economies. Now, if you are curious to learn which countries are increasingly on investors' radar screens, you may want to check out this brief 10-minute visual politic clip, which I will make available on the Canvas page. Additionally, there's a much more recent source of information, that being the February 5th, 2022 publication by Business Insider Africa that highlights the 10 most promising African economies to invest in 2022. I will embed a link to that article in the transition text leading to the second portion of this video lecture if you would like to check out the country selection provided by Business Insider.